Hi everyone! This week we're creating an easy loom knit scarf. So if you've never done a scarf like this before, I recommend starting with a practice round, so that's what we're going to do here. So we're just going to start by taking the tail end of the yarn and crossing it over the yarn. So it forms a loop like this. Then I'm going to hold the loop in place, and with my other hand, I'm going to reach through the loop and grab the tail end, but just pull it part of the way through and then pull it tight. So it will form a loop. Next, we're going to take this loop and I'm putting it on the first peg to the right of the front peg. You can go either direction on the loom, but this is more of the standard direction. I did go the other direction in my hat video. I'm just taking the tail and wrapping around that front peg to keep it out of the way while we get started. So it looks like this, and now we're going to cast on using the E-wrap stitch. So we come around the back, around the front, and around to the back. Around the back, around the front, and back around to the back. So because this is a practice round, I'm going to cast on 8 stitches. I'm not going to do the full width of a scarf. This is just to get the feel for the different kind of stitches and adding the slip stitches at the end before we get started on the real scarf. So keep doing this until you have 8 stitches, and that counts the first loop that we created. So here are my 8 stitches. And now we're going to be E-wrapping back the other direction. So for this first row, I'll take the yarn around the front of that last peg, and then go to the next peg and go behind, around the front, and around to the back. Behind, around the front, around the back. And you'll just continue this process all the way until the end. When I get to the end, I like to hold the working yarn with my other hand to keep it out of the way and keep it tight. And then on each peg, just take your tool and grab the bottom loop and lift it up and over the top of the peg. Then you can push the loop down on the peg, and that is how you do the E-wrap stitch. It looks like this once you're done with the first row. So for the next row and all the rest of the rows until you get to the end of the scarf, we're going to follow a new pattern. At the end, this will be a slip stitch. So when you start wrapping, you're not going to wrap that first peg. So we're going to skip to the one next to it, and we're just going to E-wrap that one. So come around the back, and around the front, and around to the back. Then go ahead and knit that one off by taking the lower loop and lifting it up and over the top of the peg, just like we did before. Now on this next peg, we're going to do a purl stitch. So for that, you'll take the working yarn and hold it below the loop that's already on the peg, and hold it in place there. Then take the tool and put it through the loop on the peg, and grab that working yarn and then lift it up and through that loop. Then you're going to hold that in place and lift it off the peg, and then put the new loop you just created back onto the peg. Then the next 2 pegs we're going to E-wrap. So push those 2 stitches that are already on the pegs down and then E-wrap those. Lift the bottom loop up and over the peg. Then the next peg we're going to purl stitch again. Hold the working yarn in front of the peg below the loop on the peg. Put the tool through the loop and grab the working yarn, pull it through to create a loop. Lift this off the peg and put the new loop onto the peg. And then these last 2 stitches we're going to E-wrap. And we are slipping the stitch on the very end, but when we're coming back the other direction, when we haven't just started wrapping, you will knit that last stitch with an E-wrap. So go ahead and do that. So the second row is now completed. So now for the third row, we're going to do the exact same thing, but just going back the other direction. Because we're starting a row, we're not going to knit that last stitch. So just remember, when you start a row, don't knit the last stitch, but when you're coming back the other direction to finish a row, you will knit the last stitch. So after slipping the first stitch, we're going to go to the next stitch and E-wrap it, as I have just done here. Then the next peg will be a purl stitch. So create that loop and put it on the peg. Then the next two will be E-wrap. Grab the bottom loop and lift it over the top. Then the next will be a purl stitch. And then because we're finishing a row, we'll knit the last two with an E-wrap stitch. And that completes the row. So if you keep doing this, you'll really get the hang of doing the slip stitches on the ends and using both purl and E-wrap stitches. If you're used to just doing the regular E-wrap stitch, it can be a bit challenging to get used to adding these different ones in, but if you just keep doing it for a few rows, you will get used to it a lot quicker than you think. If you're pretty new to these different stitches, I think it's helpful to just keep doing this practice one for a few more rows until you get really comfortable with the different stitches, and then you can move on to the actual scarf. So I added a few more rows onto this, and you'll see it will start to look like this. On the end here, you'll have a nice edge because of the slip stitch. And you'll be able to tell which pegs were purl and which one were E-wrap. The braided looking ones are the E-wrap and the flatter looking areas are purl. So for the actual scarf, I personally found it was helpful to write down what stitches will go where. So X will represent slip stitch, K will be the E-wrap stitch, and P will be purl. We'll be casting on 17 stitches, so I wrote down the numbers 1 to 17. Then the last stitch at each end will be a slip stitch, so go ahead and mark those. And then the stitch next to those will be a E-wrap stitch. And then after that will come a purl. And then I'll follow the pattern of 2 knit stitches and then a purl. So I'll just keep filling in the rest of the numbers with 2 Ks and a P. So it should look like this. And we're ready to get started. So just like we did on the practice one, you're going to take the end of the yarn and cross it over like this to create a loop. Then reach through the loop and grab the tail end, pull it part of the way through, and then tighten it to create a loop. Going to take that loop and put it on the peg to the right of the front peg. Tighten that up. And we're going to cast on 17 stitches using the E-wrap method. And then make sure to double check that you have 17 stitches. And we're ready to do that first row. So we'll come back crossing over that last peg and then behind the next one and around the front and around to the back. And then we'll E-wrap to the end of the row. Then once you've reached the end of the row, we'll knit those off by taking the bottom loop and lifting it up and over the top of the peg, and then pushing the loop down on the peg. Then we'll start the next row, and this will follow the pattern that the rest of the scarf will. So we'll slip the stitch at the end, so we won't knit that one because we're starting a row. Then the next peg we will use the E-wrap stitch on. Then the next one we will use the purl stitch. The next two will be the E-wrap stitch. And then one purl stitch, 2 E-wrap stitches, a purl stitch, 2 E-wrap stitches, a purl stitch, 2 E-wrap stitches, a purl stitch, and because we're finishing the row, we'll finish it out with 2 E-wrap stitches. Then to start the next row, we'll slip the stitch at the end. Because we're starting the row, we won't knit that one, but we'll do an E-wrap on the next one. Then the purl stitch, then 2 E-wrap stitches, purl stitch, 2 E-wrap stitches, purl stitch, 2 E-wrap stitches, purl stitch, 2 E-wrap, purl, and because we're finishing the row, we'll E-wrap the last 2. So this is just following that little key that we wrote on the paper. For the next row, we'll slip that last stitch because we're starting the row, and start on the next one with an E-wrap and then a purl, and then 2 E-wraps. And we'll just follow the pattern that we wrote down for the rest of the scarf until it's the length that you'd like. The first couple rows will be the hardest as you get used to this pattern and keeping track of where you are. But as I showed you on the practice one, after you've done a couple rows, you'll be able to tell which peg should be E-wrap and which should be purl by just looking at what you've knitted so far. And the braided areas will be E-wrap and the flatter areas will be purl. So just keep knitting until the scarf is the length that you'd like. A lot of people say either doing your height or a foot less than your height is a good length for a scarf. And really quickly, I just wanted to show you what happens if you accidentally knit the wrong stitch in the wrong place. Right here, I've just done an E-wrap where I should have done purl, and you can tell it just doesn't quite look right. So if you ever do that, just take your tool and lift it off the peg, and then just find the loop that loop you just created is going through. And then pull the working yarn to pull out the loop you just created, and then slide the old loop back on the peg. So this is a stitch that should be E-wrapped, but I'm going to purl it instead for the sake of showing you what happens. So you can tell it just doesn't look right back here. So to fix it, we're just going to lift it off the peg, find the loop that it goes through, so just the very next loop, and then pull the working yarn to pull out the loop we just created. Pull that out of the way, and then just take the loop, and on an E-wrap stitch it should be twisted like this. Don't untwist it, and then just put it over the peg, and that'll fix it. So when you like the length of the scarf and you're ready to bind off, I think it's easiest if you start down here at the end. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit this last row so I get the working yarn down to the left end. So I made it back here to the left end by the front peg, and we're ready to bind off. So we're going to E-wrap these first 2 stitches. We're not going to slip the stitch at the end. So it looks like this. I'll show you one more time. Just take the working yarn, Wrap it around that last peg and then around the back and around the front of the next peg. Then we'll knit both of these off by taking the bottom loop over the top of the peg. Then we'll take the loop on the right peg, move it over to the left peg, then we'll take that bottom loop and lift it up and over, so we're left with one loop here, and we'll just take that and we'll move it to the peg on the right. Then we'll take the working yarn, we'll E-wrap the peg on the right, take the bottom loop up and over the peg, take that loop and transfer it to the peg on the left, take the bottom loop and lift it up and over the peg, and transfer this loop to the right peg. And again, take the working yarn and E-wrap the peg on the right, take the bottom loop up and over the peg, move that loop to the left peg, and then take the bottom loop up and over the peg and move that loop to the right peg. And you're just going to repeat this process all the way down the row until you get to the end. Once you get the hang of it, it's very easy. When you get to the last 2 stitches, you're just going to do the same thing. Until you're just left with 1 stitch. Just like that. So we're going to go ahead and knit that one off one more time with an E-wrap stitch. Then I'm going to take the working yarn and cut it with a long tail. Then I'm going to lift that loop off the peg and then carefully put the end of the working yarn through it. And then put the working yarn through that loop that we just created to form a knot. And you can tie this off however you'd like, but I like to just keep going through different parts a couple times to tie a knot and make sure it's really secure. So once you've tied a couple knots and you feel that it's secure, just take whatever's left of the tail of yarn and you can weave it through the scarf to hide the end. This works best if you have a big needle, but you can do it by hand also. So once you've done that, the tail end is hidden and the finished end looks like this. Then go to the other end of the scarf where we started, and you can take this end of yarn and weave it in as well to hide it. And that's it! Your scarf is done. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see future videos from my channel, feel free to subscribe, and I hope you have a great day.